at least 40 babies were killed. Some of them their heads cut off. He said he's never seen acts of brutality like this.
They cut head of children.
Mothers and children, and yes, they cut off heads. They cut off heads.
Israeli Prime Minister's spokesman just confirmed babies and toddlers were found with their heads decapitated.
Stomach-turning reports of babies being killed.
Babies and adults decapitated, babies and adults burnt to death.
Behead babies, burn women, literally decimate them.
Dozens of children bound them up, burned them, and executed them.
A boy and girl, 6 and 8 years old, and their parents. The father, his eye gouged out in front of his kids. The mother's breast cut off. The girl's foot amputated. The boy's fingers cut off before they were executed.
She was pregnant woman. Stomach is butchered up, and a knife is still stacked in that baby.
Little kids who are beheaded. We didn't know which head belongs to which kid. Bastards put these babies in an oven and put on their oven.
They baked their baby in the oven and kept the woman alive so that she could hear the screams of her child melting.
The little children that were put in the oven.
Women sexually assaulted and brutally killed.
Pregnant women cut open. Guys, the things that happen are so sick.
רצח אותם, אנס אותם, הרגליים שלהם היו פתוחות. מישהו הפשיט אותם, מישהו אנס אותם.
חותך לה את השד, הוא זורק את זה על הכביש, הם משחקים עם זה.
These depraved savages raped women, murdered children, executed entire families, burning some of them alive.
Sheer evil.
They are savages. Hamas is ISIS.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם ואנחנו נוהגים בהתאם.
On October 7th, as news of the Hamas military attack on Israel started to emerge, the Israeli PR machine went into overdrive. Its propaganda blitz was predictable, and its objective was clear: shock the Western public into supporting Israel's plan to carry out the wholesale destruction of the besieged Gaza Strip. In its campaign to manufacture consent for mass death, the Israeli government found no greater ally than the unquestioning marionettes that serve as the faces and voices of U.S. mainstream media. The propaganda blitz began roughly 72 hours after October 7th, when claims that Hamas had beheaded 40 babies in Kibbutz Be'eri were first broadcast on the Israeli television channel I-24. The report was delivered by Nicole Zedek, an American-born correspondent who openly admitted the gruesome details were based on witness testimony supplied by Israeli soldiers who had responded to the scene at Kibbutz Be'eri.
One of the commanders here said at least 40 babies were killed. Some of them their heads cut off. He said he's never seen acts of brutality like this.
Her source was in fact a single soldier named David Zion.
Door after door, we killed a lot of the terrorists. We're stronger than them. They are aggressive. They are very bad. They cut head of children, cut head of women.
So who exactly is David Zion? As we revealed at the Gray Zone, when he's not in an Israeli army uniform, Zion serves as a political leader of the Shomron Council, a group that represents 35 illegal settlements in the northern West Bank. Just prior to October 7th, Zion incited deadly riots against Palestinian citizens in the town of Huwara, declaring the village of Huwara should be wiped out. This place is a nest of terror, and the punishment should be for everyone. So is this violent fanatic a credible source? Mainstream media outlets didn't even bother to ask. And of course, neither did the Israeli government.
Babies, I can tell you that they, some of them, yeah, heads were cut off. This is what we're hearing from from soldiers on the ground, you know, of toddlers and children. And yes, they cut off heads. They cut off heads.
The bogus story exploded into the mainstream during a primetime CNN broadcast on October 10th. It was there that the network's correspondent, Sarah Seidner, cited the outlandish claim of 40 beheaded babies in Kibbutz Be'eri as a verified, established fact.
We have some really disturbing new information out of Israel. The Israeli Prime Minister's spokesman just confirmed babies and toddlers were found with their heads decapitated in Kfar Aza in southern Israel after Hamas attacks in the kibbutz over the weekend.
Later that day, President Joe Biden grumbled about babies being killed.
Stomach-turning reports of babies being killed.
Soon after, the president claimed to have personally seen photographs of the beheaded babies.
I never really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children.
And from there, the atrocity narrative went viral.
We have tried to live next to them, and the result was beheaded babies.
If we cannot condemn evil acts, raping, murdering women, young girls, kidnapping grandmothers, beheading babies.
Israeli military and civilian officials have now confirmed to CBS News that children were among the victims beheaded in the Hamas attack on one community.
They found babies and adults decapitated and babies and adults burnt to death.
There were babies that had been beheaded.
Soldiers say some of the victims were decapitated.
They killed them and they cut some of their heads.
The children that were beheaded, the babies that were burnt alive, that's a tragedy.
Do you care about the babies that were beheaded?
The Israeli army and government press office, as well as the Biden White House, eventually walked back and retracted these claims altogether. Once it was plastered across the front pages of papers all across the US and Europe, the damage was already done, no matter how fabricated it might have been. And Israel then had all the political space it needed to carry out one sadistic act after another in the Gaza Strip. A live-streamed slaughter made possible by Washington, Berlin, Brussels, and the mainstream press that functioned as these governments' megaphone. Even as the beheaded baby story was exposed as a complete and total hoax, Israel and its proxies fed the media new tales of atrocities that were even more lurid than before. Many of these came from one particular individual, Yossi Landau, a religious fanatic from a self-described rescue organization known as Zaka.
Of this 14, 15-year-old, head chopped off. We were looking around for the head, couldn't find it.
Despite lacking any forensic credentials or paramedic training, Zaka volunteers were typically the first on the scene, and therefore able to make the most outlandish claims. Yossi Landau himself said that he never actually saw any atrocities take place, but that he used his imagination to tell the stories of the bodies he found.
When we go into a house and we're using our imagination.
And what an imagination he has.
I would say about 280 bodies, 280 casualties. I would say 80% was torture. 2 piles of 10 children each were tied to the back, burned to death.
And when we go into a house and we see on one side of the dining room, it was parents, father and mother, hands tied to the back. And the other side of the room, against them, there was 2 children, a girl and a boy. The same position, they were tortured. Main thing, and I wouldn't call them animals, to open up all the food that was prepared for the holiday, and these terrorists sitting and eating while torching the father and the kids, their parents and the kids. They should see each other how they're being tortured. How evil could that be?
Landau's lies were promptly amplified by Israeli officials.
Took dozens of children, bound them up, burned them, and executed them. They beheaded soldiers.
Their American counterparts, including Secretary Antony Blinken, were equally obliging.
A family of 4, a young boy and girl, 6 and 8 years old, and their parents around the breakfast table. The father, his eye gouged out in front of his kids. The mother's breast cut off. The girl's foot amputated. The boy's fingers cut off before they were executed. And then their executioners sat down and had a meal.
There was just one problem for Landau and those who amplified his questionable claims. No bodies found in Kibbutz Be'eri matched the descriptions he made. The story of the beheaded babies was also implausible according to official Israeli government data, which confirmed that only one baby, 11-month-old Mila Cohen, was killed on October 7, just one, and she was tragically shot by accident through a door, not decapitated. Landau also claimed to possess photos of a fetus that Hamas had cut from a pregnant woman's body.
When you go in, you see a lady face down. We turn her around. She was pregnant woman. The stomach is butchered up, and a knife is still stacked in that baby. The unborn baby.
Yet the images never materialized, even after the media requested them. One fact Landau did prove, however, was that the business of fabricating atrocity porn is extremely lucrative. Before October 7th, his Zaka organization was nearly broke, but in the aftermath of the propaganda bonanza they fueled, they raked in over $13 million in donations in just a short amount of time. The Israeli paper Haaretz reported that Zaka volunteers were so desperate to cash in on October 7th that they actually rearranged corpses discovered in the kibbutzim, literally playing with dead bodies in order to exaggerate the sense of horror before sending the images to potential donors. One of Zaka's competitor organizations, United Hatzalah, was eager to cash in as well. It sent its director, Eli Beer, to a Republican Jewish Coalition fundraiser. There, Beer rattled off a slew of lies that Yossi Landau would have been proud to have concocted.
I saw in my own eyes a woman who was pregnant, 4 months pregnant. They came into her house in front of her kids, opened up her stomach, took out the baby and stabbed the little tiny baby in front of her and then shot her in front of her family. And then they killed the rest of the kids. I saw little kids who were beheaded. We didn't know which head belongs to which kid. We saw a little baby in an oven. They put him in, these bastards put these babies in an oven and put on the oven. We found the kid a few hours later.
The story of a baby baked in an oven, clearly contrived to evoke the horrors of the Holocaust, was immediately catapulted into the mainstream pro-Israel press.
They baked their baby in the oven and kept the woman alive so that she could hear the screams of her child melting.
The little children that were put in the oven.
Attacks that saw a baby put in an oven and baked alive.
And even though this lie was also quickly debunked, it contributed to the narrative that Israel was confronting quote-unquote human animals, as its defense minister Yoav Gallant put it. And it therefore had the right to do anything, absolutely anything, to prevent another October 7th.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור.
Look, there's no denying that atrocities took place when Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th. But Israel wasn't content to capitalize on the atrocities that had been clearly documented on camera. They just weren't sufficient to give Tel Aviv the political latitude it needed to mount a full-scale ethnic cleansing campaign. Netanyahu himself outlined the cynical logic directly when he addressed Zaka volunteers and told them that their mission was to grant him the maneuvering room he needed to totally destroy Gaza. So the image of Hamas as a band of psychotic, ISIS-like, irrational Muslim fanatics, rather than a resistance group representing a popular constituency, rebelling against being eternally confined to a de facto internment camp, had to be reinforced over and over again.
They are savages. Hamas is ISIS.
An act of sheer evil.
The utter depravity and the barbaric nature with which these terrorists murdered and butchered innocent Israeli civilians.
Among Israel's key talking points, dutifully repeated by its stooges in the US media, was that the death toll on October 7th represented, quote, the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust.
In the wake of the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust.
The largest loss of Jewish life in a day since the Holocaust.
It was the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust.
I would argue it's the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust.
The implication of this line was obvious. Hamas had set out to kill Israelis simply because they were Jews, not because they were military occupiers. But was Hamas solely responsible for the death toll? According to the official Israeli line, Hamas slaughtered 1,400 completely innocent people on October 7th. But it's since been confirmed that at least 380 of the dead were actually uniformed Israeli soldiers engaged in maintaining the siege of Gaza. After several weeks, the official death toll was reduced to 1,200, of which 695 were Israeli civilians, after coroners determined that at least 200 Palestinians, including fighters and average citizens who entered Israeli territory, were contained in the original count. In fact, photos of Palestinians killed by Israeli missiles inside Israel's southern Gaza envelope were distributed as evidence of the savagery of Hamas against Jewish Israeli civilians. But these photos raise another inconvenient question. How did Israeli helicopter and drone pilots differentiate between Palestinians and Israelis in the chaos around the kibbutzim? I was one of the first Western journalists to question whether the Israeli military itself had in fact killed many Israeli citizens on October 7th. Relying on interviews in Israeli media with helicopter pilots who said they had no way of distinguishing between Israelis and Palestinians on the ground as they emptied their payloads, I speculated that the Israeli military had initiated something called the Hannibal Directive. This once secret procedure authorizes the army to kill not only the would-be foreign captors, but their own soldiers and civilians in order to deny Israel's adversaries the leverage they could gain by grabbing Israeli hostages. It's a dark and twisted policy, and many Americans, especially those who've served in the military, might find it impossible to understand, but it's one that perfectly serves the cynical objectives of the Israeli state. The Electronic Intifada was the first Western outlet to publicize an interview given by a survivor from Kibbutz Be'eri, who recounted how an Israeli tank crew deliberately shelled a home filled with Israeli civilians who had been taken captive on October 7th, knowing that they would all be killed. The dead included 12-year-old twins, Lyle and Ariel Hetzroni, whose deaths were promptly blamed by top Israeli officials on Hamas. At the Gray Zone, we were viciously attacked for our own post-October 7th reporting. Multiple mainstream Israeli and Western papers, as well as Israeli military officials themselves, have since admitted that Tel Aviv enacted a mass Hannibal on October 7th. Even Haaretz, which previously attacked us, acknowledged that we were actually right, revealing that the Israeli army employed the Hannibal Directive in at least 3 separate locations inside southern Israel. Describing crazy hysteria among the army's high command, the paper published an official army order which read, "Not a single vehicle can return to Gaza." So, how many Israelis did the Israeli military kill on October 7th? Was it dozens? Hundreds? Did they kill the majority of civilians registered in the official death toll? We may never know. Not only because the US State Department constantly affirms Israel's right to investigate itself, but because Western media has shown so little interest in investigating or even reporting on the Hannibal Directive, as it just doesn't fit the preferred narrative of Hamas savagery.
And pregnant women cut open. Guys, the things that happen are so sick. This is not a Netflix show, and it's not a cable news show. None of that. No, this is real life.
By this time, Israeli pundits were also openly admitting their government exaggerated the horror of October 7th to win international support for their blitzkrieg on Gaza.
נאמרים דברים כאלה שלא קרו. אני מניח שבשביל להגדיל את גודל האיבה לחמאס, כאילו צריך לצייד, כאילו לא קרה מספיק כמו שאמרת. אבל מה, אנשים ממציאים, אנשים רציניים ממציאים את האירועים האלה? התשובה היא שאולי הם שמעו כשמועה, ואולי הם זה, אבל, וזה הדבר הכי חשוב שצריך להגיד בהקשר הזה, הזירה היא לא רק צבאית ולא רק מדינית, היא בעיקר תקשורתית, ואני לא בטוח שהיא לא החשובה ביותר. גם לראש הממשלה שלנו, אגב.
So as US mainstream media took its cues from the Israeli propaganda apparatus, repeating obviously dubious narratives and quietly sweeping the lies they were told under the rug when they were eventually exposed, they also refused to report on one of the most shocking aspects of the war. The stated intention by Israeli officials and average Israeli citizens to commit genocide in Gaza.
If you gave me a button to just erase Gaza. Every single living being in Gaza would no longer be living tomorrow, I would press it in a second. Give me that button and press it right now.
There you go.
And I think most Israelis would, but they would press it, right? Like if they were in a closet alone, they wouldn't even hesitate. Someone came to them and Hadar said, no one will know. You press this, all the Palestinians are gone. You'd be like, fucking hey, is there another one?
But for the millions and millions of Americans following the war through social media, this horror was impossible to ignore. They couldn't look away from the gruesome, nakedly fascist snuff videos Israeli soldiers were posting on TikTok and Instagram from inside the ruins of Gaza. Or the viral videos average Israelis posted showing themselves mocking the suffering of Gaza residents with no electricity, water, or medicine while trying to survive under siege. Or the propaganda that Israeli state media was creating for its own citizens, showing children singing in support of annihilating everyone in Gaza. After decades and decades of grinding military occupation, Israel has become a comprehensively sick society, with masses of citizens primed for the destruction of Palestine. But you'd never know it if you limited yourself to consuming old legacy media.
Now, I know that Israel repeatedly claims that enough aid is getting in, and there is not a purposeful starvation, and those claiming otherwise are misinformed are lying.
The U.S. public's initial support for an Israeli military response to the October 7th attacks began to dwindle after several months, with polls showing that a strong majority of Democratic Party voters favored an immediate ceasefire. In the face of this PR crisis, Israel groped for a new propaganda construct that would help stop the political bleeding while keeping the bleeding in Gaza going. To determine which angle to pursue, Israel turned to Frank Luntz, a celebrity pollster who in the past had helped the Republican Party shape its tax-slashing, corporate-friendly agenda. He also designed the famous Global Language Dictionary, which advises pro-Israel activists on which focus group-tested words and phrases to use to maintain American support for Israel in its war on Palestinians. This past March, I received a tip from a political insider who had attended several briefings Luntz delivered for New York State lawmakers and various influencers. It consisted of slideshows of data Luntz had collected through focus groups he'd conducted on the war in Gaza. In one focus group, Luntz asked participants to identify which alleged October 7th Hamas crime upset them the most. A majority of respondents declared that they were most upset by the claim that Hamas, quote, raped civilians, 19% more than those who expressed outrage that Hamas supposedly exterminated civilians. So it's abundantly clear that Luntz's research influenced the next stage of Israel's propaganda blitz, as Tel Aviv quickly pivoted from beheaded babies and other completely made-up atrocities to the suddenly discovered plague of systemic rape by Hamas on October 7th.
The world has to decide who to believe.
Israel rolled out its new phase of propaganda at its own United Nations mission in November 2023 in a high-profile event featuring speeches by some of America's leading pantsuit feminists, including billionaire tech oligarch Sheryl Sandberg, the regime change-obsessed former U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and Democratic Congresswoman Kirsten Gillibrand. The event was complemented by protests outside the UN headquarters featuring literal crisis actors, women impersonating rape victims, dramatizing events for which no concrete evidence existed, in order to pressure feminist organizations into more vocally supporting Israel's murderous assault on Gaza.
When I saw the list of women's rights organizations who have said nothing, I nearly choked.
As usual, the Western mainstream press reverted to its role as Tel Aviv's obedient stenographers.
One of the least discussed atrocities in the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel is coming into horrifying focus tonight. Stories of women sexually assaulted and brutally killed.
The tsunami of atrocity porn culminated with a front-page article in the New York Times, the paper of record, purporting to demonstrate beyond the shadow of a doubt that Hamas had engaged in a, quote, pattern of gender-based violence on October 7th, sexually assaulting Jewish Israeli women as part of a calculated campaign of terror. At the Gray Zone, as we began examining the sources in the Times article, it quickly became clear that we were witnessing yet another atrocity hoax, and an especially cynical one, which exploited the real crime of sexual violence against women in order to manufacture consent for an ongoing campaign of ethnic cleansing. One early telltale sign that the New York Times article was tainted was its reliance on the serial fabricator, Yossi Landau from Zaka, despite his established record of lies. The Times also turned to an anonymous paramedic from an Israeli Special Forces division known simply as G, who claimed he had found the bodies of 2 teenage girls in a bedroom in Kibbutz Be'eri, whose corpses showed clear signs of rape. The only problem was that no teenage girls were found in the condition that G described, or ever recorded discovered in Kibbutz Be'eri. It was so bad that the spokesman of the kibbutz issued an official statement contradicting the anonymous paramedic's allegations. But G was undeterred and was allowed to continue inventing stories.
One of my teammates, he realized he saw a dog that was barking near a trash can, and we stopped by there, and he opened that trash can and he pulled out of the garbage a baby, perhaps maybe not even more than a year-old baby that was multiple times stabbed all over his body and tossed into the garbage.
But as we already know, only one baby was killed on October 7th, and she was shot by accident, not stabbed and thrown in a trash can, meaning there was simply no way G could have possibly been telling the truth. Once again, a key New York Times source had been caught lying. From top to bottom, the Times' screams without silence investigation relied on the shadiest possible sources, those with a record of spinning out stories that defied logic and which seemed too absurd to believe on their face. One of them, an anonymous 24-year-old accountant, described by the Times as a witness known only as Sapir, told the paper that after she had been shot in the back while fleeing the attack on the Nova Electronic Music Festival, she saw several Texas Chainsaw Massacre-style gang rapes and murders, including one in which, quote, she saw 3 other women being raped and terrorists carrying the severed heads of 3 more women. If we're to believe Sapir's testimony, then we must also believe that while on the most consequential mission of their lives, trained and highly motivated Hamas fighters decided to take a break in order to sexually assault and mutilate women just for fun. And rather than take these 3 women hostage that Sapir described, which would have granted them enormous political collateral, they beheaded them just for the hell of it. And this was all physically possible while under fire from Israeli police and special forces. This is what we're actually expected to believe. When the Israeli paper Haaretz asked their country's police for forensic evidence to back up Sapir's outrageous decapitation claims, they said they'd come up empty-handed. So once again, the shocking beheading story was exposed as a complete fairy tale. Perhaps most tellingly, the casualty intended as Exhibit A of Hamas savagery in the New York Times Screams Before Silence article was a woman called Gal Abdush, branded by the paper as a symbol of the horrors visited upon Israeli women and girls during the October 7th attacks. The Times dubbed this young woman the woman in the black dress, referring to a grainy cell phone video of her clad in a tight-fitting black dress, splayed out dead next to a burned-out vehicle. The Times' stubborn insistence that Abdush had been raped, despite a lack of forensic or visual evidence, proved to be too much for the young woman's bereaved family. On January 2nd, Abdush's sister, Miral Alter, took to Instagram to light into the New York Times, stating matter-of-factly that her sister, quote, was not raped. There was no proof that there was rape. She also pointed out that the timeline between her sister's last message to her family and the time of her reported murder made it simply impossible for a rape to occur. How in 4 minutes were they also raped and burned, Alter asked. The New York Times article had unraveled on every level the whole narrative of systemic sexual assault by Hamas, which Israel had introduced to the Western public to justify escalating its brutal assault on Gaza, and which the mainstream press dutifully disseminated, stood exposed as a farce. At around this same time, Hillary Clinton's friend and financial backer, the pro-Israel tech oligarch Sheryl Sandberg, was preparing to release a major documentary aimed at sustaining the propaganda. Building on the New York Times Debunked article, she called it Screams Before Silence. Unlike the Times, however, Sandberg also relied on videos of Palestinian prisoners filmed by Israeli interrogators in which the prisoners appeared to confess to brutally sexually assaulting Jewish Israeli women on October 7th. As we demonstrated at the Gray Zone, the most outrageous confessions by Palestinian prisoners did not match up with any atrocities documented on October 7th. Worse, there is simply no way that these testimonies had not been coerced through threats and hideous acts of torture, a clear violation of the Geneva Convention's Article 17 governing the treatment of prisoners of war.
قام هؤلاء مجموعة الكيتر واليماز بالدخول علينا ملثمين بضربنا لمدة 50 دقيقة وهم يضربون بنا وهم يضحكون. قاموا بإدخال الكلاب البوليسية علينا بعد أن قاموا بتثبيت أيدينا إلى الخلف وتعصيب أعيننا.
So in providing a platform for violently coerced, false confessions to advance the dubious narrative of her propaganda film, Sheryl Sandberg had violated one of the most important tenets of journalistic ethics, and therefore become a party to Israel's crimes. And in an especially dark twist of irony, the hoax advanced by Sandberg, the New York Times, and so many other Western publications would soon be revealed as de facto policy by Israeli soldiers against defenseless male Palestinian prisoners held in Israel's archipelago of torture dungeons. In a shocking report relying on testimony from 55 former Palestinian prisoners, the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem demonstrated that the Israeli prison system after October 7th had been transformed into what the group called a network of camps dedicated to the abuse of inmates as a matter of policy. According to B'Tselem, these facilities, in which every inmate is deliberately subjected to harsh, relentless pain and suffering, operate as de facto torture camps. At the heart of Israel's network of torture centers is Sde Teman, a facility in the Negev desert, which was built after October 7th to imprison the thousands of men captured by the Israeli military in Gaza. Human rights groups across the world have demonstrated that many of those languishing in the facility are innocent civilians, including physicians kidnapped from hospitals in Gaza and subjected to sadistic acts of violence and torture. At almost the exact time when Israel's international propaganda apparatus was spinning out concocted stories of Hamas militants sexually assaulting female Jewish ravers on October 7th, members of the shadowy Israeli military unit, known as Force 100, were actually gang-raping defenseless Palestinian men in Sde Teman. We know this is true not only thanks to testimonies by former prisoners who told the media and human rights groups that they had been sodomized by Israeli soldiers with electrified metal rods, but because there was actual video evidence. The soldiers responsible for these hideous crimes were clearly filmed sexually assaulting the prisoners. Once again, an allegation Israeli propagandists made against Palestinians was exposed as a confession. The soldiers' culpability for sodomizing Palestinian prisoners was never a matter of dispute. In fact, a dozen members of Force 100 were charged and indicted in an Israeli military court for sexually abusing the prisoners. And what happened next exposed how hollow the prosecutions actually were. Because as the soldiers were transported to a military base in the occupied West Bank called Beit Lid, Israeli nationalists launched a series of riots in support of the accused gang rapists. And no one was arrested in the riots. And at the time of the filming of this documentary, the soldiers have yet to be charged. As protests continued across Israel in support of the soldiers, and of the very practice of sodomizing Palestinian prisoners, calls for exonerating the soldiers poured forth from top Israeli government ministers. Shockingly, according to a poll by the Israeli Institute for National Security Studies, a whopping 65% of Jewish Israelis opposed prosecuting the soldiers. That's 2/3 out of all Israelis. Meanwhile,
Shabbat Shalom Am Yisrael.
The Force 100 soldier charged as the ringleader of the gang rapes, which took place inside Sde Teman, Meir Ben Shitrit, was transformed by Israeli national media into a folk hero.
הערב בתוכניתנו לוחם כוח 100 מאיר בן שטרית שהתמודד עם הנוח'בות בשדה תימן ועכשיו מתמודד עם האשמות קשות וכולנו רוצים לשמוע מה יש לו להגיד וגם יהיה...
On one Israeli talk show, a mainstream pundit argued that the only thing wrong with raping Palestinian prisoners was that the practice had not been formally institutionalized as military policy. But the policy was necessary, he insisted, because Israel needed to exact revenge for the rape that he was certain took place on October 7th.
בגדול, עוד פעם, זה מעניין לי את העכוז מה עשו לאיש חמאס הזה. אני כל הזמן זוכר, קודם כל, הדבר היחיד שמבחינתי הוא בעיה פה, זה שזו לא איזושהי מדיניות מוסדרת של המדינה להתעלל בעצירים. כי בגדול, זה גם, קודם כל מגיע להם, וזה אחלה נקמה שאנחנו צריכים לתת להם.
And who convinced this bloodthirsty pundit that mass rape had taken place on that fateful day? Without question, it was the Western mainstream media, CNN, the BBC, The Guardian, the New York Times, and Sheryl Sandberg, the illustrious legacy outlets which enthusiastically legitimized the Israeli government's crude colonial propaganda. In doing so, their deceptive coverage created real-world consequences for Palestinians who had been placed under siege in Gaza, branded as human animals, then kidnapped and hauled off to torture centers. As long as these outlets refused to retract or even correct their lies, US politicians on the largest stage in the world will continue to repeat them.
These depraved savages raped women, murdered children, and executed entire families, burning some of them alive.
When Navi Pillay, the judge in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, convicted 3 media personalities for supposedly inciting the Rwanda genocide, she said the following: "You were fully aware of the power of words, and you used the medium of communication with the widest possible reach to disseminate hatred and violence. Without a firearm, machete, or any physical weapon, you caused the death of thousands of innocent civilians. Those words can and should also be directed at the media outlets which trumpeted Israel's bogus October 7th atrocity propaganda, helping it generate international support for an assault on Gaza that has killed, injured, or disappeared close to 10% of its total population by this point. That indictment should also be directed at the powerful elected officials who to this day continue to repeat the lies about what happened on October 7th.
Because the people of Israel must never again face the horror that a terrorist organization called Hamas caused on October 7th, including unspeakable sexual violence and the massacre of young people at a music festival.
So what can we, the citizens of the countries backing Israel's destruction of Gaza, do in the face of all of this? First thing we have to do is recognize our power. We might not have endless resources like Israel and its army of propagandists, but we have something more powerful. It's the truth, and we're using it to get to them. Take it from Alex Karp, the ultra-Zionist CEO of Palantir, a private military contractor that is pioneering AI targeting systems and testing them on the people of Gaza, when he discussed the importance of the intellectual battle being waged right now.
We kind of just think these things that are happening across college campuses especially are like a sideshow. No, they are the show. Because if we lose the intellectual debate, you will not be able to deploy any army in the West ever.
Alex Karp is actually right, and that's a good thing. What he's saying is that we still have the power to challenge the war machine he represents, which is raking in record profits from the war on Gaza and beyond. So we have to continue our efforts to never let them rest, to bring our protests, voices, and independent media to every place we can. We have to use our power while we still have the right to do so.
Why do you have no red lines on the death of children in Gaza? Is there anything that will lead you to turn away from your support for Israel's genocide, any level of dead children? Hoyer, why do you think the Democrats have no red line on genocide in Gaza? How much money have you accepted over your career from AIPAC, and do you think that's a factor in why the Democrats have no red lines?
No.
Reverend Sharpton, any comment on AIPAC pumping millions in to defeat black progressive lawmakers? So why do you never comment on what Israel's doing in Palestine? It's a civil rights issue. Senator Booker, why have the Democrats just done so little to exercise leverage against Israel? Do you think it's AIPAC money? How much AIPAC money have you taken over your career? I mean, is it weird to provide comic relief to an administration that's shipping bombs to a genocide? Is that weird? Caitlin, Max Blumenthal from The Gray Zone. Do you think CNN's coverage after October 7th was too one-sided and it created support for genocide? Caitlin, nothing about all the lies CNN told about October 7th, beheaded babies, mass rape by Hamas, creating consent for genocide? Max Blumenthal from The Gray Zone. Why do you think Biden has shown so few red lines in Gaza?
I don't have time to talk to you.
But you're a former researcher for AIPAC. Do you think Israel has too much influence in the media? Have you ever acknowledged on air while supporting the Gaza genocide that you worked for the Israel lobby? I used to work for AIPAC, and now I support Israel's genocide in Gaza. I'm Wolf Blitzer.